I was pouring coffee in my flannel robe when the sound of a chainsaw split the morning air. For a second I thought it was the neighbors trimming trees again, until I glanced out my front window and saw 3 men in safety vests tearing up my land. One guy had a measuring wheel, another had a clipboard, and the third one was revving up a chainsaw dangerously close to the oak tree I planted with my dad before he passed. And right in the middle of them all, barking orders like a field general, stood Karen Langston, the HOA President, with a clipboard in one hand and a look on her face like she owned the world. My jaw clenched as I threw the coffee on the grass and stormed outside, not even bothering with shoes. I was done playing nice. And when the contractor took one step toward that tree, I pulled out my phone and made the call I'd been saving for years. Sheriff Collins picked up on the first ring. I didn't even have to explain. All I said was, "They're here. Bring cuffs." 10 minutes earlier, I was still enjoying what was supposed to be a peaceful Sunday. My property sits right outside the boundary of an overly aggressive HOA development that's crept closer and closer every year. I inherited this land from my father, who bought it long before the HOA was even a twinkle in some developer's eye. We kept to ourselves, paid the proper county taxes, and lived without interference. But things started to change last year when Karen became the new HOA president. She'd stopped by once to drop off a newsletter and, I kid you not, left with a glare when I told her I wasn't part of the HOA and had no intention of joining. Since then, I've had a string of strange occurrences. Mail getting misdirected. Trash bins overturned. One time I even found a laminated HOA violation notice pinned to my shed with a thumbtack. I took it straight to the sheriff, who laughed and said she was testing the waters. I figured she'd move on to easier prey. Apparently, I was wrong. So when I stepped out that morning and saw the 3 men walking around like they were prepping for a groundbreaking ceremony, I didn't hold back. I asked the man with the clipboard what he was doing on my property. He barely looked at me before mumbling something about lot expansion and pointed toward Karen like she was his handler. She waved at me with the smugness of a dictator unveiling a new monument. I told them all to stop immediately. Karen stepped forward with a stack of papers and started rambling about community enhancement, how the HOA board had voted to construct a shared meditation pavilion to promote wellness. She said the area I lived on had been redesignated as common use land during a recent annexation vote. When I told her she had no legal right to do anything on my property, she smiled and said, "Well, you should have read your mail. The vote passed 6 months ago." My hands were shaking, not from fear but from rage. I'd built that little cabin with my father's own hands. We had dug every post hole together, planted that oak tree to mark the start of our land, and poured years into making the area home. Karen had no clue what that tree meant to me, and she definitely didn't care. I knew her type, used to running things, steamrolling anyone who got in her way. I calmly told her to remove her contractors and get off my property before I called the sheriff. That's when she made her mistake. She nodded to the man with the chainsaw and said, "Just start with the tree. He doesn't have any legal standing here." That's when I called Collins. By the time the sheriff's trucks pulled up, one of the contractors had dug a line across my yard, and the chainsaw guy had just finished cutting a notch into the base of the oak. Karen stood with her arms crossed, acting like she was about to break a bottle of champagne over a ship hull. I stood with my arms folded too, except I had a folder of documents and a copy of the original deed in my hand. Sheriff Collins didn't say a word at first. He just looked at the mess, looked at Karen, then looked at me. I handed him the documents and pointed toward the chainsaw. His eyes narrowed. Karen tried to intercept him with her own folder, which looked suspiciously like it was printed off a home computer. Collins asked if she had filed this with the county registrar. She stammered. Then he asked her if Daniel here ever signed an agreement to join the HOA. She said not officially, but by proximity. Collins actually laughed at that one. When he turned to the contractors and asked if they knew they were working on private property not included in the HOA, both of them looked visibly uncomfortable. One said he was just told to show up and dig. The other said Karen had insisted everything was cleared with local authorities. Collins looked at me again, then said, "You want to press charges, I assume?" I nodded. That's when he waved over his deputy and gave the order. The contractors were placed in cuffs without protest. Karen, on the other hand, started screaming. She demanded the sheriff arrest me for obstruction. She said I was interfering with HOA development plans. She called it an ambush and a setup. Collins just smiled and said, "Karen, you trespassed, falsified paperwork, and nearly damaged a registered landmark tree. You're lucky this man's being civil." She went red in the face. The whole neighborhood had come out by then, standing behind the property line watching with wide eyes. It wasn't just about land anymore. It was about someone like Karen thinking she could rewrite rules because she felt powerful, because she assumed no one would push back. I wasn't just defending dirt. I was defending legacy. And the worst part? This wasn't over. Not even close. Because if Karen thought this was just going to end with a couple arrests and a slap on the wrist, she had no idea who she was messing with. The sirens had faded, but the tension on my land lingered like fog refusing to burn off in the sun. Sheriff Collins stayed behind after his deputies escorted the contractors away, and Karen stood stiff as a board, clutching her now crumpled folder like it held some kind of divine authority. I offered her a seat on the porch, half out of sarcasm and half to keep things from escalating again, but she refused and insisted that I was making a mistake. Collins chuckled at that. He'd heard her kind of mistake-wielding threats before, people who used power like a sledgehammer and didn't expect the wall to hit back. Karen kept going on about how the HOA had full legal standing, how I was just a squatter on old land nobody wanted until the neighborhood improved the area. Collins cut her off mid-rant with a single line. "Unless you can produce a county-registered deed showing otherwise, you're the one trespassing here, Karen." I went inside and came back out with a locked firebox containing all the land records my father left me. It included the original 1970 deed handwritten and notarized, the 2006 updated digital survey certified by the county, and an aerial photo taken by the planning office that clearly outlined my land as separate and untouched by any HOA boundaries. I laid them out carefully on the porch table and watched as Collins inspected every one. Karen leaned over to glance at the documents, still trying to find some gap she could twist. She pointed to the aerial photo and said smugly, "But our development is just over that fence. We were told that the buffer zone was considered transitional land." Collins squinted at her like she'd grown a second head. "There's no such thing as transitional land, Karen. You can't just claim dirt with a vote and pretend it's legal." Karen's face twitched. For a brief second, she looked almost nervous, like she realized her words were slipping out faster than her mind could manage. But her pride kicked in again, and she stood tall, declaring that she would return with the HOA's lawyer and the full board to resolve the matter. I told her to bring whoever she wanted, but they'd be answering to more than just me. Collins asked me if I wanted to file a restraining order then and there. I said no, not yet. I wanted her to walk into her own trap first. I wanted her to bring every piece of fake paper, every entitled threat, and every one of her smug supporters, so they could all watch it collapse together. After Karen finally left, red-faced and huffing into her phone, Collins stayed behind and helped me clean up the damage. The notch in the oak wasn't deep, but it would need patching. He offered to send a local arborist to seal it professionally before any bugs got in. I agreed and thanked him for being quick to respond. He slapped my shoulder and said, "You did all the right things, son. But this isn't over. Karen doesn't strike me as someone who accepts being wrong." I knew he was right. I had a gut feeling she would double down instead of back off. Some people can't let go of the illusion of control. She was the queen of an HOA kingdom, and I just built a stone wall around the one plot she thought she could snatch. That night I dug deeper. I pulled out every file my father had kept on land boundaries, county disputes, and old planning committee letters. Turns out my father had been cautious for years, anticipating encroachment from the moment the HOA was first proposed in a town hall meeting nearly 2 decades ago. He'd even written a letter to the board at the time stating explicitly that his land would remain autonomous, non-participatory, and under no circumstances was to be included in future neighborhood development plans. The letter had been notarized and logged with the county clerk. I couldn't help but smile. Dad always planned 5 moves ahead. And now, even from the grave, he was still blocking their advances. The next morning, I got a knock at the door. It wasn't Karen this time. It was one of the contractors, the one with the chainsaw. He looked nervous and asked if we could talk. I brought him to the porch and handed him a glass of water. He looked around like he expected someone to be watching. Then he said he wanted to apologize. He explained that Karen had approached them through a third-party maintenance bidding group, claiming she had full jurisdiction over the land and that she just needed a fast crew who doesn't ask too many questions. She paid them half up front in cash and told them to show up Sunday morning with no paperwork, just tools. He said he'd had a bad feeling about it but needed the work. He then told me Karen warned them not to engage with me if I came outside. Just keep working, she said. He admitted that after the sheriff showed up and the cuffs went on, he realized he'd nearly lost his license over someone else's lies. He didn't know how far she'd gone, but he was now planning to give a full statement. I thanked him, gave him the contact info for Sheriff Collins, and told him to speak freely. The law would protect him, and so would I. That man left with more relief than I'd seen on anyone's face in weeks. Later that afternoon, I drove down to the county office with my documents and met with the registrar. They confirmed once again that no annexation had been filed involving my land, no new surveys had been submitted by the HOA, and no HOA vote carried any legal weight unless accompanied by a signed waiver from the landowner. I requested an official letter stating all this, and they provided one on county letterhead. I had it notarized right there. By the time I returned home, Karen had already emailed me. The subject line read, "Final opportunity to resolve this peacefully." I didn't even open it. I printed it, sealed it in a folder titled Evidence, and dropped it in the cabinet next to the rest of the files. Karen still believed she had cards to play. But she didn't know the game had changed. She was still bluffing with fake hands, and I had every ace stacked in county records, law enforcement backing, and 30 years of paper trail. She would come again. That was certain. And when she did, I would be ready. Not just to stop her, but to expose her. Not just to protect my land, but to dismantle the little empire she thought she ruled. Because people like Karen only understand one thing: consequences. And they were coming faster than she could imagine. It didn't take long before the next storm rolled in, except this one didn't come with clouds or thunder. It came with lawn chairs, lemonade jugs, and half a dozen HOA board members trying their best to look official. Karen had returned, and she hadn't come alone. They parked in a line just outside my property, just close enough to make a scene but not close enough to get arrested again. I watched from the front porch as they set up folding tables like it was some kind of outdoor court hearing. Karen stood in the middle, flanked by 2 younger men in suits who clearly didn't want to be there. One was flipping through a binder while the other tried to avoid eye contact with me completely. I figured they were either junior lawyers or overly eager interns sent to play defense in a battle they didn't understand. Then came the bullhorn. Karen raised it with the sort of confidence only someone totally disconnected from reality could have. She called my name like a school principal calling a truant child to the office. I didn't respond. She called again, claiming I had failed to attend several community mediation meetings, and that the HOA was here today to finalize the property integration process. Her words made no legal sense, but her tone made it sound like she was reading a verdict. I stepped off my porch slowly, walked up to the edge of my boundary line where the fence marked my land, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "If you step one toe over this line again, it won't be a warning next time." It'll be court dates and criminal records. Karen lowered the bullhorn but didn't back down. She said this entire thing was a misunderstanding that had spiraled into chaos because of my refusal to cooperate with neighborhood unity. That was the moment I realized she was laying the groundwork for a narrative. Not a legal argument, a public one. She was trying to make it look like I was the unreasonable one, the aggressive landowner standing in the way of progress and peace. She kept talking about community wellness and cohesion, about shared spaces and green development goals. Behind her, the board members were nodding like programmed dolls. She was putting on a show. But what she didn't know was that I'd already prepared my counterperformance. I waved my hand toward the driveway, and a moment later, my neighbor Cynthia walked up with a laptop and a small portable speaker. She was an older woman with a reputation for keeping everything: letters, emails, neighborhood flyers, even voicemails. She'd been waiting for this. I handed her a flash drive. She plugged it in, pressed play, and the air filled with Karen's voice. It was a recording from 2 weeks prior, taken from Cynthia's porch camera. Karen could clearly be heard saying, "We'll just fake the vote. He won't know. That cabin guy keeps to himself. We don't need his permission." Then laughter. Then, once it's built, what's he gonna do, bulldoze it? The shift was immediate. One of the board members stopped nodding and turned to her with an open mouth. Another stepped back like he'd been burned. Karen's face dropped. She started shouting that the audio was doctored, that it was taken out of context, that I was violating her privacy. Cynthia calmly replied that the audio came from a legally placed outdoor camera facing her own yard and that she had already submitted a copy to the sheriff. Karen's words were unraveling right in front of everyone. Her perfect script had just torn at the seams. I looked at the two men in suits, who now looked visibly uncomfortable. One of them closed his binder and muttered something about needing to verify certain details. Karen tried to gather herself, but her control was gone. The board members began whispering to each other. A few asked her directly if what they had heard was real. Karen didn't answer. She grabbed the bullhorn again and shouted that this was all a smear campaign, that I was manipulating people against her, and that she had been working tirelessly for this community while people like me sat in isolation doing nothing. At that point, another voice joined the conversation: Jerry, the HOA Vice President. A quiet man, rarely involved in disputes, he stood and addressed everyone. He said he'd reviewed the bylaws himself the previous night and found no language supporting forced annexation of non-member property. He then turned to Karen and asked if she had ever obtained my written consent to be included in HOA jurisdiction. Her silence was answer enough. Jerry then did something unexpected. He took off his board badge and dropped it on the table, saying he refused to be part of an organization that used deception and intimidation to expand power. It was like knocking over the first domino. 2 more members followed, each visibly disgusted. One woman teared up and said she had trusted Karen to lead fairly, and now felt betrayed. Karen tried to salvage the moment. She said people were overreacting. She begged them to sit back down, to remember the vision they had agreed on. But the board had shifted. The crowd that had gathered, neighbors curious about the commotion, had heard enough. It wasn't about land anymore. It was about trust. And Karen had just shattered hers in front of an audience. Before she could dig the hole any deeper, a squad car pulled up. Not in response to an emergency, but because Sheriff Collins had been invited by Jerry after hearing about the planned stunt. Collins stepped out, surveyed the scene, and asked me quietly if he should intervene. I told him no. Let her keep going. Let her reveal the full extent of her entitlement. And sure enough, Karen approached him, demanding that he arrest me for slander and privacy violations. Collins smiled politely and asked her if she'd like to make a statement for the ongoing investigation instead. Karen turned pale. As the crowd dispersed and the board members packed up their folding chairs, Karen stood alone at the edge of the driveway. Her posture sagged for the first time. No clipboard. No bullhorn. Just silence. I turned to walk back to the cabin, but not before saying one final thing. Next time you come here, bring a lawyer and a miracle. Because evidence doesn't lie, and neither does a 30-year boundary line. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. Karen's foundation had cracked wide open, and I was ready to drive the truth straight through the middle of it. There was more to uncover, and I had a feeling her paper empire was one inspection away from collapse. The morning after the public unraveling of Karen's stunt, I woke up to the sound of a truck engine idling outside. I peered through the curtain expecting another round of nonsense, but it was just the arborist Collins had arranged. The man stepped out with his gear and approached the oak tree like a surgeon assessing a patient. After a few minutes, he confirmed what I already feared. The cut made by the chainsaw hadn't reached deep enough to kill the tree, but it left an open wound susceptible to disease and insect infestation. He treated the damage, sealed the wound, and promised to check in a few weeks later. As he packed up, he asked if I knew why someone would want to damage a healthy tree so precisely. I just smiled and said, someone thought they could bulldoze history and got caught halfway through the job. By now the entire neighborhood had seen the video or heard about the showdown. People who'd never even waved at me before were driving by slower, some offering a thumbs up, others honking in support. One elderly couple left a pie on my porch with a sticky note that read "Thank you for standing up to her." But I wasn't celebrating yet. Karen might have taken a public beating, but something told me she wasn't done. People like her don't crawl away quietly. They regroup, they plot, and they try to rewrite the ending to make themselves the hero again. That suspicion was confirmed when I got a knock on the door that afternoon. This time, it was one of the contractors from the original incident, not the chainsaw guy but the one with the measuring wheel. He looked sheepish but determined. He said he'd spoken to Collins and agreed to make a formal statement but wanted me to know what he'd found. Karen hadn't just hired them under false pretenses, she had created entirely fake paperwork to support the project. He showed me an email she'd sent labeled site clearance and approval, complete with a phony logo at the top that looked like it came from a copy-paste job. He'd realized too late that the company name listed didn't even exist in the county registry. He also mentioned that Karen had offered them cash bonuses if the job was finished quickly and without complaint. She emphasized that the landowner, meaning me, was an off-the-grid guy who wouldn't respond legally and that everything would be wrapped up before anyone noticed. I took down his full statement and thanked him. It was the final piece I needed to show that Karen hadn't just trespassed, she had orchestrated a deliberate, fraudulent operation involving forged documents and manipulated workers. And now I had the evidence, in writing, from one of the people involved. That night I met with Cynthia and her nephew Paul, who happened to be a retired forensic accountant. We sat around my kitchen table, reviewing all the documents I had compiled over the last few weeks. Paul found something shocking. Karen had been moving HOA funds into a side account labeled Community Beautification, but there were no corresponding projects ever approved in the board minute. The numbers didn't add up. Over $10,000 had disappeared in less than a year, and the only clue was an address, her own. She'd used HOA money to renovate her deck, replace windows, and even install a hot tub. Paul printed the entire audit with itemized records and date stamp. It was bulletproof. We submitted the file to Collins, who took it straight to the district attorney. The investigation into Karen's HOA activities was no longer just about trespassing. It had escalated into fraud, misappropriation of funds, and obstruction of property rights. Collins told me the DA would need a formal witness statement, and I agreed without hesitation. I wasn't just defending my land anymore. I was tearing down the little empire she had built on lies, intimidation, and the assumption that nobody would ever push back. Word got around quickly that Karen was under investigation. The HOA board scrambled to hold emergency meetings, but they had lost most of their support. 3 more members resigned, leaving the organization in disarray. Jerry, the vice president, stepped in as acting head and immediately froze all HOA projects and spending until further review. He contacted homeowners directly to inform them of the financial audit and assured them that everything would now be handled transparently. For the first time in years, people felt like they had a voice, and they knew exactly who had silenced it before. Karen, meanwhile, tried to regain control of the narrative. She sent out a newsletter blaming radical elements for sabotaging community goals. She claimed the recording was edited, the contractors were coerced, and the audit was part of a witch hunt. But the more she fought, the worse she looked. Especially when a local reporter started digging into the story after Cynthia's nephew tipped them off. They published a front-page article titled "The HOA Queen's Collapse," complete with Karen's smiling headshot next to a bold list of allegations. That same week, the sheriff's office served her a subpoena in broad daylight. She wasn't smiling then. A few days later, Karen showed up on my land again. This time she didn't bring contractors or board members. Just herself, arms crossed, face tight with resentment. She stood at the fence line and called out to me in a calm voice, almost too calm. She said she wanted to talk, that she believed we'd both gone too far, and maybe there was a way to work together. I didn't even get up from my seat on the porch. I simply pointed to the new metal sign I'd installed on the gate that morning. It read "No trespassing. Federal investigation ongoing." Karen stared at it for a long moment, then turned and walked away. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of something heavier. Finality. For the first time since this war started, she knew she had lost control. Not just of the board, not just of the project, but of the lie she'd been living. And there was no hiding from it anymore. I went back inside, poured myself a cup of coffee, and opened the folder labeled Case Documentation. Everything was in order. Every piece lined up. Every voice was accounted for. The tree outside stood tall, bandaged but unbroken. Just like the land beneath it. Just like me. And Karen? She was about to find out what accountability really looked like when it showed up with facts, witnesses, and a paper trail longer than her list of excuses. The courtroom wasn't packed, but it didn't need to be. The few people who were there represented the heart of the neighborhood, longtime residents, former board members, the two contractors she had dragged into her mess, and a few quiet faces from the county office who had been pulled in as witnesses. Karen sat at the defendant's table in a charcoal gray blazer that looked 2 sizes too stiff. She had a tight-lipped smile and kept her eyes forward like she could will the walls not to close in. Her attorney shuffled papers beside her, whispering fast, trying to prepare her for what was about to come. Across the aisle, I sat calmly. I hadn't come for revenge. I'd come for truth. I had every document, every photo, every notarized record stacked in a folder like bricks in a wall that she could no longer climb over. It wasn't just me now. The entire system had caught up with her. The judge entered and the courtroom stood, then the real show began. The district attorney opened with a statement that painted a clear timeline, from Karen's forged documents and misuse of HOA funds to the trespassing incident and the audio recordings. He called Sheriff Collins as the first witness, who testified about the events on my land, the contractor's statements, and the documents he reviewed at the scene. Then came the contractors themselves. Both men confirmed under oath that Karen had paid them in cash, provided no real permits, and instructed them to avoid speaking with me. The one with the chainsaw added that Karen had promised to handle any legal noise if it came up. He looked directly at her when he said it, and she looked away. Then came the financial audit. Paul, Cynthia's nephew, took the stand with a confident, steady voice. He walked through the timeline of the beautification fund, explaining how the records had been doctored to hide personal expenses. He provided photos of Karen's property improvements, all time-stamped, and cross-referenced with HOA funds withdrawals. The judge listened carefully, occasionally raising an eyebrow, but mostly just scribbled notes without comment. By the time Paul finished, Karen's face was blank. Whatever defense she had been preparing was shrinking by the second. Karen's lawyer tried to counter by painting the situation as a misunderstanding, arguing that Karen had believed the land was already absorbed into the HOA due to its proximity and that the financial discrepancies were a result of disorganization, not malice. But the evidence was overwhelming, and when they tried to question me, I stuck to the facts. I described how my father had kept records for decades, how I had received no notice, attended no vote, and never signed any agreement to join the HOA. I showed the deed, the county map, the notarized letters. There was nothing left for her to hide behind. When the judge finally spoke, the room held its breath. He stated clearly that Karen had knowingly trespassed, misrepresented legal documents, violated property rights, and misused community funds. He issued a formal fine, a court order removing her from the HOA board permanently, and directed the district attorney to begin civil proceedings for restitution on behalf of the HOA members. Karen didn't argue. She didn't cry. She didn't even move. She just sat there, staring down at her lap like the weight of everything she had built was crushing her in real time. The fallout was immediate. The HOA held an emergency election to appoint a new board. Jerry was made interim president, but instead of taking power, he formed a temporary oversight committee and announced an external audit of the entire HOA system. Residents were finally heard, and changes were made within weeks. People were no longer afraid to speak at meetings. The community began repairing itself, not just structurally but socially. The fear Karen had ruled with was gone, replaced with an honesty no one had expected to return so quickly. Jerry approached me a week later with a ceremonial offer to join the board as a community liaison, saying my level-headedness and preparedness were exactly what the neighborhood needed. I politely declined. I told him I had no interest in overseeing anyone else's land, but I would be happy to help create a legal orientation for new members and help set up transparent channels for future dispute. He agreed and even asked me to name the initiative. I called it Know Your Lines. It seemed fitting. A few weeks later, I hosted what the neighborhood jokingly called the Fence Line Festival. It wasn't much, just a barbecue with lawn chairs, music, and a fire pit, but the turnout was bigger than expected. Collins showed up, Paul and Cynthia brought lemonade, and even the two contractors made an appearance. People laughed, shared stories, and enjoyed the kind of peace we hadn't felt in a long time. As the sun dipped low and the fire pit glowed, I stood beside the oak tree and watched the laughter echo across the yard. For the first time in months, the land felt quiet again. Right again. And then, in the middle of the gathering, Jerry approached with a small envelope. It was postmarked from the county courthouse. Inside was a single-page, handwritten letter. It was from Karen. The words were carefully written, like each sentence had been passed through several layers of pride before it reached the paper. She apologized, not for everything, but for the things she said were regrettable actions under pressure. She mentioned therapy, court-mandated counseling, and a hope that someday the neighborhood would remember her for more than this. It wasn't sincere. Not fully. But it was something. I placed the letter in a frame and hung it in my shed, right beside a printout of the fake HOA vote she tried to pass. Beneath both, I nailed a plaque that read "Nothing crosses this line without permission." It was both a joke and a reminder. A reminder that boundaries matter. That truth matters. That no matter how loud someone shouts or how many people they fool, facts win in the end. And so does patience. Karen's reign was over. My land was mine again. And every tree, every corner, every post hole dug with my father's hands, still stood exactly where it always had. Untouched by her ambition. Protected not by fences or threats, but by proof, by community, and by the refusal to back down. That's what beat her in the end. Not revenge. Just the truth with a backbone. And I'd do it all again if I had to. But hopefully I won't need to. Because now, if anyone tries something like that again, they won't just face me. They'll face an entire neighborhood that finally woke up. One that learned the hard way what happens when power goes unchecked. and what happens when good people decide enough is enough.